There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise.
Thank you. So we have this idea that we're going through, Christ has come, and now everybody who obeys Christ, they're all one. They're all heirs according to the seed promise of Abraham. And so we start in chapter 4, and we keep going through this point, and we start with the idea that we are heirs. And so now we can actually read verses 1 through 3. So if you could get that, Mr. Billy.
Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is a master of all, but is under the guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the Father. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world.
Okay, thank you. So we see here, this is the state that we were in before crucifixion, or at least they were. Back before Christ had come, they were still as a child. And so I like the analogy that uses, we're going to come back to this, but we have, if you look in verse 22, you see the idea that there was the bondwoman and the free woman. That's in reference to Hagar and Sarah. And so the child of the bondwoman, that's what the Mosaic law, that's what the children under the Mosaic law were in reference to. And then we have Christ. He died. And then now we are sons of the free woman, the true promise. And that's the whole idea that I want us to get from Galatians chapter 4, is that they were coming from the old law, and they were trying to return back to it. And there is no return to the old law. There can't be. And so, how does that apply to us? Well, let's not turn back to the doctrine that we used to hear, like, say, Catholic, Methodist, Baptist. If we came from these backgrounds, let's not return to that old doctrine. That's what he's trying to get across to these Galatians. And so, I want us to look at Galatians 3 and verse 24. I'll read that real quick. Chapter 3, verse 24. It says, "Therefore the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor." And so, I've heard this before. It's actually really interesting. If you look back at the word tutor, if you look at the King James, it's actually schoolmaster. And if you look back to the Greek, it's actually guardian. It's not the word guardian, but it's very close to that. It's not a teacher, but it's somebody who would direct somebody to school. And so the same thing applies with us in the old law. The old law was not meant to save. It was meant to direct us to Christ. We are to be brought to Christ because ultimately, can the old law save us? No. But Christ can. So that was the purpose of the old law. And he's saying, don't go back to that. You have no life in the old law. Your life is in Christ Jesus. And it's amazing. You look back in so many different books, and he's having to address this topic so many times. The Hebrew writer spends like 3 or 4 chapters on this. But it's interesting to think is that, how do we apply that to ourselves today? We are not to return to the old doctrine that we used to believe in. If we see here later in the chapter, there are people, I don't know if it was pagan worship or if it was just another reference to the old law, but they were worshiping the beggarly elements. They were turning to these old doctrines which they had believed. Back in Galatians 1, verse 6, he said, "I marvel that you are so soon turning away from what you've been taught." It's amazing to look at. But I want us to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And so, Kat, I believe we're up to you. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And if you could get verse 50, and Michael, could you get verses 56 and 57?
Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does corruption inherit incorruption.
All right. And Michael.
The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ.
Thank you. So we have some verses in between, I know. But the main idea is that the flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. What was the law about? What was? Yes. It was the law of the flesh. We are under the law of the Spirit, the law of the heart. It's more about the spiritual, mental side of things. These people, they obeyed fleshly ordinances. If you look at Hebrews chapter 9, verse 10, it goes into a little bit more detail. It says, these fleshly ordinances were imposed until when? The time of Reformation. When Christ died on the cross, that's when these fleshly ordinances were put nailed to the cross. Colossians 2:14. But he's saying this was of the flesh. And so that's why it cannot save us. Why can the law not save us? Because it's according to the flesh. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. So he's saying that those of the Spirit can. So that's why we obey Christ. Does anybody have anything on that before we move on?
Well, I think it's some of our problem today. The old law was comfortable for them. They could see it. They could physically, the laws were there. They could put their hands on them. It was all about the stuff that was around them.
Mm-hmm.
It was the flesh, and it was comfortable for them. And then when the Christ came, and he didn't change the law, he fulfilled it, but it made it seem like harder to them.
Mm-hmm.
The sayings were harder because they didn't understand. They were still thinking in the flesh. And it's just harder for somebody to realize that you can murder somebody in your heart and never lift a hand.
Mm-hmm.
That was a new concept to them because it had been ingrained in them so long. They even have refuge cities and all this other stuff set up for that purpose. So it was difficult to come away from the physical side of it.
That's true. It's like the new law, you had to use your head a little bit more. The old law, it was pretty black and white, wasn't it?
Right.
And honestly, that's how it was supposed to be, because they didn't have an old law to kind of give us an idea of what had happened before and how we were supposed to change our lives. Because the old law, it's still there for our learning.
Mm-hmm.
We still have this there that it gives us sort of almost like a template, an outline of how God wanted things. And then you get to the new law, and now we can fully understand what we're supposed to do. But those under the old law, they didn't have that. So everything had to be of the flesh, but it never saved them. And so we move on from the fleshly ordinances and we get to the spiritual. And now we have the more perfect law. If you look in Hebrews chapter 6, it talks more about that. It says, the old law was imperfect. It had problems. Now, I said it did not have problems. It just wasn't complete. It wasn't complete like Christ. Its purpose was to direct to Christ. So, if nobody has anything else, I guess we can move on. Go
I was
ahead.
going to say it's easier for us to, with the distance and time and separation that we have, to see those parallels between the old and the new. And they were living it. They were trying to figure it out while they were trying to live it. And I think that's a lot harder to jump into something like trying to build the boat while you're in the middle of the ocean kind of a thing. So they were still trying to figure it all out, not being able to see those parallels as clearly as we can.
It's like we look at the Israelites. We give the Israelites such a hard time, don't we? It's like, why would you do that? Like, why would you turn back to this? And honestly, you're right. It was much easier. It's much easier for us now to look at all this in retrospect like, I see. That's what God wanted. That was his intention. We see the intentions that God had for a lot of these things. They didn't. All they had was the commandment, which was harder for them to obey without knowing the full understanding of why. That's a good point. Thank you.
And I think also, what you said it was easier. And why did the Israelites turn to pagan life? Because they didn't have to keep all of these laws and festivals and holy days and all of these things. They didn't have to do anything except what they wanted to do. It was a simple life and living a pagan life. And isn't that the way we are today? Why do people walk away from Christianity? Why do they walk away from the Lord? Because it's simpler. It's easier. But we're not here to live a simple as an easier life. We're here to do what God says, and then eternity will be simpler and easier. But yeah, I think it's the same now.
I think also in the Old Testament and in the New, it's daily. I mean, every day for them and for us, it can be a struggle. It's something that we're learning. We should be learning every day and thinking about God every day and doing what he wants us to do every day. And it, I mean, it's just the law is different, but it's still a daily thing that we need to be thinking about every day.
Well, it's more
Glorifying God every day.
That's true. It's more of the mind. It's more of the spirit. Back in the old law, you didn't really have to worry about much except for a couple days a year, and if you killed somebody, like we get that. And then we get to the new law, and it's like, well, no, you have to glorify God in what you say, what you do, what you think every single day. It's a constant renovation of yourself. And that's true. So needless to say, we can understand why they were slipping back into this old doctrine, back into the old law.
Well, I was going to say, in a sense, though, Judaism was far more complicated. When you look at the New Testament system, it's actually simpler and easier. It's more difficult mentally because you don't read in Leviticus about when your mind goes to this place and you think of it. No, it was like you kill this animal and you put it here and you cut it and you do the, it was very, very rigid, 280 some odd ordinances, whatever it was, I don't remember. Whereas in the New Testament, it's completely different. I'll give you an example. Today, studying with a young man, I don't remember his name, 2 years ago from Guadalupe, who was an auntie. And he basically said, I just feel more comfortable with the auntie congregations. Got into, well, are y'all binding, whatever. But the thing was, like, you're actually more comfortable in a more restrictive setting. It's kind of like these Judaizing teachers. It's like, no, you got to keep everything.
Yeah.
And you got to do
Oh,
Christianity.
what they always do.
Yeah.
A lot of people just want to be told what to do.
True.
I can do X, Y, and Z and I'm good. And it was also a societal thing for the Jews. It was their culture, their religion, like everything. So they had people constantly watching them and telling them your toes out of line, step back over here. And so it wasn't just the religious aspect of it.
That's true. It's interesting to look at this is that we don't have a basic outline of rules and regulations. We have some things that are given. But let's say that it bothers my brother if I eat meat. We have an example like that. That's a new law that personally applies to you. The law is different for everybody. And I don't want to say that as in like a denominationalist, like you have your law, I have mine. But your brethren actually do have an impact of what you can do, what you are allowed to do. So the law in some areas was different for different people. And don't take that the wrong way. Truth is truth. The truth that we have in the New Testament, that's what we have. But let's say that my brother is struggling in an area. I am now obligated to come and help this brother. Does that make sense?
When they were struggling in matters of opinion, that's what
Yes.
they're trying to point out.
Or even if it was a doctrinal issue, I am now obligated, not in the same sense, but to help him be able to understand and also get right. I'm supposed to reprimand him. So there were different laws that people just didn't understand yet. They didn't have this, it wasn't the same. So
Not necessarily different laws, one law, but different situations for
Yes.
different people.
yes, it was not a different law. The truth that we have is the truth. Well, I think we're going to run out of time, so we have to keep moving on.
Got 3 verses, you're good.
I know. Let's go ahead and read verses 4 and 5. I think we're up to you. No, you're not. All right, you good with reading?
I'm gonna need a little bit more. I came in a little late. So
Okay,
what
that's
am I at?
we're going to be Galatians 4, and if you could read verses 4 and 5. We see this is where the shift happens. We have our state before we come into this law, before Christ died, and now we're making a shift over. So if you could go ahead and read that.
But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons.
Okay, so just in these 2 verses alone, you could spend a whole hour for a sermon here. There's like 5 or 6 different points you can pull from this. But the first one I want to look at is God had a timeline. He had and he still has a timeline. He always has throughout the fullness of time. And this phrase here, when the fullness of time had come, we see that God had a timeline. He knew when this was going to happen. He knew where. But when and where what would happen? The church. Verse 2. If you look back at verse 2, it says, until the time appointed by the Father, they were still under these things. They were still as a slave almost. But we see that God had a timeline. So if you look at John chapter 7, verse 8, this isn't as strong, but if you look at it, it's saying how when Jesus' mother comes to him and says, you help them out to do this, I know you can. It says, this doesn't concern me, my time has not yet come. It's time for his ministry, for when he could go out and teach. It was going to happen, and we see that God had a timeline. He knew when that was going to happen. The same thing with Judgment Day. We know that's going to happen at a certain day and hour. That verse is Mark 13:22. But he's saying, in that day and hour, nobody knows except God the Father. We always pull the point that nobody knows when it's going to happen, but God does. God has that set. He has that timeline. He has everything blocked out, and nothing that we can do or say can change that. Nothing this world does. can change when and where. Judgment Day, well, where's going to be here, but when that's going to happen. We also see that the new law, like we looked at, verse 2, we see that Christ died. That was going to happen at a specific point. And we see that the church, it came when the fullness of time had come. I believe we had a really good lesson probably about 2 years back, but I forgot who did it, but it was about Daniel. And it had Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the gold, the silver, the bronze, and each one of those represented a country. And he said, this is what they did to help Christianity be able to become a thing. I always take the Romans. The Romans, what did they give to Christianity?
Language,
Yes.
structure, you name it.
That's true.
Yeah, tons of stuff.
Without, I just take
Persecution.
persecution.
That did help the church grow.
That's true. It made it spread. But could the church have spread like without the simple example of roads?
I would have found a way,
He would have.
but that was his way.
That was his way. Is
The
that
common
that
language, the common Greek language at the time, it was so
That's
widespread.
true. And that language we now have cemented in history, which will never change, unlike stupid old English. It's always changing on me. But yeah. But that's true. A common language, roads. It connected the whole world. It connected the known world at that time. And that was able to let Christianity spread. It was a common denominator. So that's a good point. We also see in verse 4 that Christ was born under the old law. Now this is a simple point, we get that, but from Matthew 5:17, I believe you touched on this earlier, but Christ has not come to destroy the old law, but he came to fulfill it. One thing that when I was little always confused me is like, is Christ under the new law because he's in the New Testament? Like we see the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, I guess he's under the new law. And so we always need to understand, he was under the old law at every point of his life. When he died, that's when it did not destroy the law, but it completed it. And then we move on to the new law. We have the church. We have all that. And so, does anybody have anything on that? Anything to add? And if not, let's go ahead and move on. Verse 5. There's one thing I want to pull from this is that there's the idea of the adoption. Let's read it again. It says, to redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Now, this analogy here, this metaphor, it helps me understand because when you say a son, it's like, well, does that mean you can't fall away? It was a little confusing, but this right here, it says the adoption as sons. I want us to look real quick at Romans chapter 11. I wrote to you. Romans 11. And since we don't have much time, I'm just going to have you read verses 23 and 24.
And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, who are natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree?
Okay, there's a lot of points that come from this passage, but the one thing that this always stuck out to me because when I first read this, I had a garden and I planted trees. And so the idea of grafting is you have this natural tree, the vine, as you will. In the Gospels, we have Christ as the vine. Let's say he's the tree. We are the branches, but guess what? We are grafted in. Let's say that we were of the world. Now he's cut a slot for us and he's put us in. Now we can't be taken back out. That's the other thing, is that the adoption does not mean you are now a son forever. You are not predestined. But I think that's very interesting, just to be able to see the grafting. It's a good metaphor for me to understand personally. But does anybody have anything? Sounds good. Should probably ask that a little less often. But we see there's the adoption. We see the inheritance in Colossians 3:24, which refers to heaven. And then if you go back to Galatians 3, verse 29, it says that we are heirs according to what? What does it say?
Promise.
Good. We are heirs according to the promise. The promise that was made to Abraham is that there's going to be a seed, there's going to be Christ. And guess what? There was the nation of the Israelites, but guess what else there was? There was the nation of Christians. There's going to be a nation that will extend to the whole world. That was part of the promise. You will extend to the corners of the earth because of Christ. It is part of the promise. We are now a part of the promise as Christians. Let's keep moving on. Let's go to verse 6 and 7. Mama.
And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, excuse me, crying out, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ.
Okay, thank you. So we looked at the adoption. And it says, now because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of the Son into your hearts. Isn't that interesting to look at? We are, within us, when we are baptized, we literally do change. The Spirit comes upon us. I want us to look real quick at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Brock, you can get this. 1 Corinthians 6, and we're going to look at verse 19. This talks more about how the Spirit comes upon us in a way. The Spirit is now in our hearts. Go ahead and read.
For do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own?
Thank you. That last phrase there, you are not your own, because you are God's. The Spirit is in you. The Spirit is in your heart. And he's saying, I find that very interesting to look at, is that you become literally a different creature, a new creature, because you now have that Spirit within you. If anybody has anything on that, please let me know, because I'm going to try to move quickly through this. We're going to look at the next passages. The next big block that we have is going to be verses 8 through 20. We're not going to read all of that at once, but we see this is when Paul starts getting into the nitty-gritty about certain things. He says, I'm concerned for you in this way. We're going to start by reading verses 8 and 9. Ms. Ruby, I think we're up to you.
But then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not God's. But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage?
Thank you. So I would like to get some feedback on this, is that there's two possible scenarios. This is referring to people under the law or people simply in the world. And I thought it might be people of the world, because it says, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not God's. But now you did know God, and now you're returning back to these things. And so if this really is like pagan worship, then we see that the church of Galatians, Paul is having to juggle a couple different things. He's saying, in the first chapter, he says, why are you turning back to that doctrine so quickly? And he's saying, maybe that's to the old law, maybe that's to pagan worship. And now I want us to look at Romans 1, because it's sort of the same scenario. Kai, I think we're up to you. Could you get Romans chapter 1 and verse 25?
Who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worship and serve the Creator rather than the creator. The creature instead rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen.
Thank you. So this specifically, we know this is in the pagan lifestyle. This is different denominations. It's not Judaism. It's none of that. That specifically is pagan worship. And he's saying, y'all were in the church, and then you went back to that. Now you're going back to what we see in chapter 4, the beggarly elements. Do you worship the moon? Do you worship the stars? Do you worship gold, silver? You're turning back to these fleshly things. He's saying, you knew God. You came to God, and if we see in 2 Peter, it is better that you would have not known God than for you to turn back out of that. I find that very interesting, is that I do want to know, do y'all think that that is Judaism or that is pagan?
I think that it's both. While we've been doing this study, we've been seeing him talk a lot about the law. Why would he be talking so much about the law to just pagans? I think that he's speaking to a mixed assembly, and the Jews are having a hard time moving away from their law, and the pagans are having a hard time, they're having a hard time moving away from paganism and other things. So when he says weak and beggarly elements, he's not just talking about, their statues and things that they would take from the world and worship, but he's also talking about the weak and beggarly elements of the law in itself, because the law was it was never meant to save us. So I think that he's speaking to both people and making points, because the Jews are probably coming in and confusing a lot of the people who are coming from the world. And like we said earlier, it's easier to be told to do A, B, C, and D. And paganism is very ritualistic as well. So the Jews are probably coming in and trying to press upon these pagans and probably confusing them and maybe getting them to do some of these things that are in the law, like circumcision and things like that we've seen in other chapters confuse pagans as well. That's just what I think from it.
That would be probably the most logical scenario. That makes the most sense if it were a mixture of both, say, pagans and those who are going back to Judaism. But what did they have in common? They were turning back to their original doctrine. They were rejecting Christianity after being a part of it. They were trying to infuse this doctrine, and if not, then they were going to go back. They were trying to bring these old customs into Christianity, which he's saying, you can't do that. Christianity, there is a set of rules. There is truth. There is a common truth. I believe we talked about that in 2 Corinthians 13. But there is a set of definite truth. And he's saying you can't infuse your old doctrines back into this. Good point, thank you. I believe that would be what it's referring to. Because you see the beggarly elements, you see those who did not know God at all, and then you have those who knew God, but then were turning back to Judaism. So does anybody have anything else on that? All right, let's keep trucking along. We're going to next read verses 10 and 11. How you read? I think we're up to you now.
You observe days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain.
Thank you. This is also another thing that I wonder if it's pagan because of this, is that they had certain holidays, these certain months, days that they were worshiping. And I didn't know there was going to be a reference point to this, but if you look over in Romans chapter 14, it actually talks a little bit about this, and I was surprised to find this. Romans chapter 14, verses 5 and 6. And I think, Mr. Billy, we're up to you. Romans 14, verses 5 and 6.
One person esteems one day above another esteems every day alike. Let each be careful, let each be fully convinced of his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks, and he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat, and gives God thanks.
Thank you. It's interesting to look at, because if you look at this, again, we see that there are some people who esteemed other days higher than others, and then some who esteemed every day alike. What is he saying here? Is that, let's say that I observe Christmas as a holiday where we give gifts, and let's say that brother so-and-so does not. He observes December 25th as any other day. What difference do we see? We see that they have a holiday, which this is a realm of opinion. He's saying, if you observe a holiday, if you observe a day, observe it to the Lord. Make sure that you understand that if that has no bearing on the gospel, and so therefore, just observe it secularly. Observe it to the Lord. Don't use it as a sin or anything like that. And then those who don't observe it, also don't observe it to the Lord. Make sure that God is given the glory. And if you cannot give God the glory by observing a day, then don't do it. He's saying you can observe Christmas. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying as in this is not the day that Christ was born. It's not what I'm saying. But let's say that I like Christmas because we give gifts and we have a good time with family. And let's say that my brother does not. We can still both have these matters of opinion as long as we observe or don't observe to God. I like this verse. So there's a lot of concepts in here which, if you're not careful, you sound like Baptist. So you have to be very careful.
In Galatians, he's pointing out the days and weeks and months and times of years. Because under Judaism, it's talking about what they observed. There were days, there were festivals, there were all of that. And in Galatians, as well as, I remember the other one is, I mean, there's a point of correction. You cite Romans 14, that's a weaker, stronger brother. The weaker brother is not to remain in the weaker state. Like, if someone was like, oh, I celebrate the Sabbath every Saturday, that's a New Testament Christian. Okay, well, you forbear with them in the realm of opinion, but that they may grow on to the full knowledge of that. If you leave a weaker brother, nowhere in scriptures do we say, well, you leave a weaker brother that way. No, they have to be strengthened too along the way. Because Galatians is much stronger than what the Roman passage is talking about here.
And I did think about that. I wasn't really sure because it did mention like months and seasons and years, just different things. Is that I didn't know if that was referring to just Judaism or maybe, like you said, it could be referring to both Judaism and paganism. And I think he's trying to teach this to both because he can't just say like, don't observe this day, don't observe the Sabbath. He didn't say that, and he also didn't reference pagan holiday. He just said days, months, seasons, years. He said if you observe it to God. And like you said, can we observe that to God? Under the new law, can we observe the Sabbath to God? No, because he never commanded that. And he also said that's been done away with. It's been nailed to the cross. Therefore, you cannot. That is not within the realm of opinion. That is a matter of doctrine. And so, thank you for that point. It's important to clear up. Let's see. Let's keep on moving on. We're going to go start in verse 12. So, you read, didn't you? All right. Kat, if you could please read verses 12 through 14.
Brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. You have not injured me at all. You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at first. And my trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Jesus Christ.
Thank you. So we see, this is the part, we are going to get a shift in verse, 15? There is going to be a shift, but what we see here is that Paul had an infirmity. We don't know what that is for the sake of the points that he's trying to make. We don't know his infirmity. We simply don't need to. If you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10, it talks a little bit more about that. Michael, could you please get that? We're actually going to look at that. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10. And he's describing his infirmity as a tool, almost. Is that the weakness that it brought him physically, it also gave him strength spiritually. So whenever you get that, please read it.
And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities than the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Thank you. And so, it's interesting to look at because he makes reference of this infirmity, something that hindered him physically in some way. We don't know what that is, but we do know that it was to the point where he asked that it may be taken away from him. And God told him no. And we see here in Galatians chapter 4 is that they received him with the infirmity. And in fact, is it easier? I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this. Is that out of weakness, this weakness made him strong. He said, lest I should boast. Let's just say that I was in perfect physical condition and I had a lot of money. Just for reference sake. If I tried to preach to you the gospel, it would be very hard for me to do that because of the pride that I would have. The pride that I could have. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with physical perfection. But he's saying this helped me be able to preach the gospel to others. It made me strong. And he's saying here, y'all received me. In verse 15, it says, what then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear witness that if possible you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. we see that he was able to preach this blessing, this gospel, and that in turn, this produced zeal for other people. Does anybody have anything on that? Because I do want to kind of keep this thought a little continuous. Alright, so let's keep reading because this is important. If you keep reading verses 16 and 17, it says, "Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? They zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them." Okay, so now we have false teaching. Paul is saying, "Am I the enemy because I teach you the truth? I taught to you at the beginning, and you were so zealous you would have plucked out your own eyes from me." But he's saying, now am I your enemy? I'm still teaching you the truth. What's happened? Who are we up to? I guess you can read. We're going to go ahead and go to 2 Corinthians 12:6. If you could please read that. And while you're getting that, let's look at verse 16 again. He says, "Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" Paul's saying, I'm going to tell you the truth. You may make me your enemy, but that's on you. Go ahead and read.
For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. But I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me.
What do we see? Paul's going to speak the truth. Paul said, I'm going to speak the truth to you, and that's an example that we're supposed to have. Back in chapter 4, he says, become like me. In 1 Corinthians. I think it's 1 Corinthians. He says, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. But he's saying, do as I do because I'm going to speak the truth. In Romans, we see the commandment. We are to speak the truth to others. Does anybody have anything on that? Sounds good. Verse 17. We're going to read 17 through 20. So, Brock, we're up to you. Can you read verses 17 through 20?
They zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them. But it is good to be jealous at a good thing always, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, for whom I labored birth again until Christ is formed in you. I would like to be present with you now, and to change my tone, for I have doubts about you.
Okay, thank you. So, like we said, this produced a zeal. They had an original zeal that, what happened to it? It grew cold. It's down. They no longer have the same zeal that they first did. And now another word for zealous is that there's others who are trying to recruit them because they're getting tired. They're tired of this same doctrine and they want to go to others, and others are seeing this and they want to pull them out of the church. And they can't. But that's the idea that's happening here. And we see, I want us to look at chapter 6. Go back, actually 2 Corinthians. Oh my goodness. Slipping. Yes. Galatians 6, verses 9 and 10. Mom, I think we're up to you.
Galatians 6, 9 and 10.
Yes.
And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith.
What's he saying here?
Don't grow weary, keep doing good to all, but especially Christians.
Keep it up. You're going to get tired. That new Christian feeling is going to wear off. You're eventually going to want to turn back to what we see. They want to go back to Judaism, paganism. They want to go back to their old doctrine because they're growing weary of doing these good works. They're tired. And Paul is telling them, don't grow tired. It's a good thing. Keep it up. I think that's very important.
I see that passage being especially pertinent to our own congregation because we were so much like these
Yes.
new Christians and those new churches in Bible times, and they needed that pep talk. Like, okay, don't turn back, don't go back, don't take the easy road. Keep it up. That city needs a church. Keep up the work that you're doing, just like us.
That's true. I don't want to go out and door knock. Go out and door knock. Keep it up. You're going to have to
Or
continue.
and for them also, don't just walk away. Don't just fall back to the easier road, to your old ways of not living for God. Would it be easier to go down the road to the big, giant congregation there that's not doing things just right? Yes.
Very much so.
But, we need to keep it up.
Mm-hmm. I like what he's saying is just, Christianity isn't easy. The concepts that we see in the Bible, they're relatively easy. We can get But it's easier said than done, isn't it? There's going to be hard times in this life. It's going to be hard as a Christian. It's bleak to think about, but guess what? That's what Christ asks of us. Is that
You
we...
could also be lonely.
That's true.
You could be lonely.
We've been blessed with people who are very close in this congregation. I've seen it happen in larger congregations, and also people, I've seen it in kids. They're lonely because they're the only Christian in school, and it's hard. It's very lonely. They grow weary in doing good when sometimes they see it as vain. It says, you are not laboring in vain in 1 Corinthians 15. Your work is not in vain. Don't grow weary of doing it. Let's go ahead and move on if nobody else has anything. We're gonna kind of try to skim over verses 21 through 31, because we don't have much time left. But we're gonna read this a little bit faster. So, Mr. Billy, I think we're left with you. I want you to read verses 21 through 26.
Tell me who you desire to be under the law. Do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by the bondwoman and the other one by the free woman. But he who was at the bondwoman, but he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and who was of the free woman through the promise. Which things are symbolic? For these are the two covenants. The one from the Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all.
Thank you. So if you look at the example back in Genesis, we see that Abraham and Sarah, they were growing. They didn't understand how the promise was going to come to them, so they brought in Hagar, and they had a son named Ishmael, and that was the son of the bondwoman. That was not perfection. That was not the completeness that God desired. And then you have Isaac, who is from Sarah. That was the heir. That was the complete son. And now we are of that complete son, is what he's trying to say. Isaac represents the new law. Ishmael represents the old law. The old law, they kept Ishmael for about 16 years, if I believe. And then they were sent away, and then Isaac was the sole heir of Christendom, Christ. But it's an interesting analogy. It helps me. Israel and then Christ. Did not mean to say Christendom. But anyway, sorry about that. We see that Ishmael was not going to be the sole heir, and so he eventually had to be sent away. I want us to look at Hebrews chapter 8 in verses 6 and 7. I'm going to read that real quick. It says, "But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second." And then if you keep reading on through the end of the chapter, really, if you look at verse 13, it says, "In that he says a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is what? Ready to vanish away." We see that the old law was never meant to be the permanent law. He's saying if it would have been perfect, why did Jesus die? Jesus would have died in vain, as we see. So it's interesting to look at. I know we've already talked about this, but the old law had to be sent away because Christ was the sole heir. Is the heir. We are now under a better covenant, established on what? Better promises. I find that very interesting. Does anybody have anything else before we move on? Let's go ahead. If you look at verse 27, this is a quote from Isaiah 54:1. I'll read it real quick. It says, "For it is written, Rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband." We see here, what do we see? It was kind of hard for me to decipher what this is trying to say. But he's saying that strength that you would have seen, like that, the obvious choice would have been Hagar, wouldn't it? He's saying that that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for somebody who is desolate, this humble abode. he's saying this is what the promise is going to come from. Saying, rejoice, O barren. Just when we look at that, that's Sarah. She was under it was very hard for her. She was barren and she was desolate, as it would say here. And eventually she had many more children. I find that very fascinating. But as we close, I want us to look at verse 28. Actually, let's read the rest of the chapter. Who are we up to? You? Could you read verses 28 through 31?
Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir to the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free.
Thank you. And it's interesting. We see that there is a separation. There's a separation between the bondwoman and the free woman. There's a separation from us now and from the old law. There's a separation between us and the people of the world. I'm going to read from 1 Corinthians 6 real quick. I'm just going to read verse 11. Verses 9 and 10, it gives a list of things that, sinful lifestyles, things that we are not. And you look at verse 11, it says, and such were some of you, but you were washed and you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. Again, what are we always trying to point to? Don't go back to that old doctrine. Stay away from that old doctrine. Christ is what saves you. Nothing else. Obedience, as through what we see in the Bible, obedience to Christ is how we're going to be saved. It's the main point that we can pull from today. But sometimes we mess that up, don't we? Are we separated from the world? Always? Sometimes we join that world every now and then. And we need to make sure that we are separated. We are sanctified. It said we are justified, blameless. We need to make sure that we stay away from the world. And I know this is a very simple point, but sometimes we forget that as we fall back into temptation, to these sins that you see that the old world does. Some things that you always associate with the world. And so, if you look at verse 30, it says, cast out the bondwoman and her son. For the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. Heirs of what? Promise. Go back to the very beginning. Actually, chapter 3, verse 29. Right before it. Heirs according to what? Promise. That promise, heaven. We are part of the church, which we will be transmuted into heaven. It's a very comforting thought, and we need to evangelize to those of the world, because guess what? They are not heirs. And he's saying specifically those who are still holding on to those old doctrines, those things which God never commanded. They are not heirs. They will not make it to heaven because they're holding on to what they used to have. And so, while we close, I do want us to remember that there is an intentional separation between us and the world. So that's about all I have. Thank you for your time.